Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Rye.
And I'm Courtney.
And just to recap where we were last week, we were continuing our self-care series, and we're continuing with that today. And we're really focusing on emotional resilience. And last week we talked about, we can control some things, we can influence others, and some things in our lives, the stressors, the things that we're concerned about, that we want to complain about, we can't control them or influence them. And the issue for our resilience is that if we fixate on those things that are out of our control and our influence, they drain us. They're this constant burden. And to become more resilient, we can be intentional about focusing our energy where it counts. And Rye, I think since last week, you had an experience with applying this. Why don't you share that?
I have. So Nick and Courtney, I shared with you this week coming into this week at least, there was several things that were pulling my attention, and we had kind of a big week full of professional learning. I think we had 4 days full of it. And I'm taking 2 grad classes, so I am in my finals week, and I shared with both of you that I have about nearly 20 pages of papers to write by the end of this week. And kind of reflecting on last week, I chose to focus my energy and influence my situation by setting a goal for myself to just write 2 to 3 pages a night. And I am happy to report I have stuck with that goal, and I am on page 9. And I just feel in a good spot and will be ready to finish up my semester by Sunday. So
congratulations,
so
Rye.
Exciting.
Good for you. This week we're going to talk about the holidays. That episode's called Merry and Bright. We're going to talk about holiday self-care. We thought that would be timely and a good opportunity to touch on some new things, and also review and touch on a couple things we've already talked about. So we're going to talk about self-care strategies that are particularly important at this time of year. We're also going to talk about something from our friend, the instructional coach, the wonderful Elena Aguilar, and her book Onward for educators about resilience, that she recommends that's particularly important at this time of year in December, is looking for the bright spots in our lives, because it is literally dark outside for much of the day. And then also figuratively, it helps our resilience as educators to be looking for those bright spots in our lives.
Before we get to that, though, let's discuss what is filling our buckets today. I will start. Speaking of the darkness outside, Nick, I went for a walk after dark last night, and it was just wonderful. There were so many Christmas lights. It was peaceful. There was nobody else out. It was cold enough, so I just felt, it was brisk. It was just very pleasant, and I think I'm going to keep doing that more often. It was really nice.
It sounds very hygge.
It was.
If I were Danish, I would say that's a very hygge thing to do.
It was fantastic. What about you,
any
Ryan?
chance you saw any northern lights? I hear that you can kind of see them this week.
I did not. I think I was out way too early. I mean, it was still early in the day, but it was dark. But no, I did not see northern lights. What's filling your bucket, Rye?
Well, this week, actually tomorrow, is my daughter's golden birthday. And when you're 11, golden birthdays are a big deal, right? So we're in COVID, this pandemic, and trying to make a golden birthday kind of special is kind of hard. And so at one of our professional development things that we attended this week, it was all about technology. And I learned about this cool educator app called Flipgrid. A little plug here for all you educators in the room, but I actually set up an account for a page to receive some well wishes and some birthday messages from friends and family using this app. So I've been getting all of them coming in, and it's just been so special, hearing what all these people love about her are, some of the same things I love about her. But so that is filling my bucket.
That's awesome.
What about you, Nick?
So cute.
A couple of the teachers in that session with us who were also learning about Flipgrid or who had experience with Flipgrid, they were calling it like TikTok for teachers or Snapchat for teachers. Because it's
I mean, it was one of the more appealing things that made me want to check it out further, and it's been good so far.
Well, and yeah, funny enough, my bucket filler is about teacher TikTok because Ryan Courtney finally got me to join TikTok, and I am really, really enjoying it, but I'm very much enjoying the teachers on TikTok who are hilarious. And one little video that caught my particular attention that I really enjoyed was a teacher. The text on the video was teachers at their 2020 Christmas parties. And then the audio of her, she was lip syncing to this audio was Snoop Dogg. And he was saying, last but not least, I want to thank me. I want to thank me for believing in me. I want to thank me for doing all this hard work. I want to thank me for having no days off. And it just keeps going from there. And it just kind of perfectly encapsulated, I think, the just where teachers are at, all like the debt that this country owes to teachers. And yeah, teachers should be thanking themselves and acknowledging that. And it's just really nice to see teachers voicing that and so many other things on TikTok. So plug for that. It is really nice if you want to feel like some togetherness and like we're all in this together and have similar emotions and thoughts right now. It's nice.
For sure.
Yeah, it's nice to see the teachers like making light of the situation and bringing some humor into the pandemic as well.
Yeah, lots of really hilarious like all due respect, they'll put in the comments, not trying to offend anyone, but then they do kind of like play out the typical student interactions they're getting around like homework and grades and such during the pandemic. So some of that is just really funny.
For sure. So let's shift to our main topic. The holidays are fast approaching, and we just want to talk a little bit about how we can take care of ourselves during this time of year that just naturally brings a lot of lows or highs or both at the same time. So why is self-care extra important during the holidays?
Well, it's not breaking news to people, certainly, that holidays bring extra stress into our lives. And actually, any major event, this is just an event that happens every year, but any major life event tends to bring extra stress. And I think it was in college that I learned, they survey people and do some research on, rating your top 10 most stressful life events. And some of those are things that would be bad, like the death of a loved one. But in the top 5 tends to be things like getting married or starting a new job. So even those happy events, quote unquote happy events, tend to bring a lot of stress because there's a lot of upheaval and change and a lot of extra demands on our time and attention and our emotions. So just because it's a joyful time of year, quote unquote, it doesn't mean that it's not going to bring that extra stress. So first of all, it's just like, it's incredibly normal. Like some people might look like they're having a wonderful, joyous time, but I think pretty much across the board, this ups our stress level a little bit. Anyone who's planned a wedding, for example, can probably draw those parallels between, we were talking pre-podcast about our experiences either planning or being in weddings, about how stressful that process of planning all of this and making sure that everyone is having a good time is really similar to the holidays in a lot of respects. But trigger warning, we're going to go on for a minute or so here and talk about kind of more like, what do the holidays bring? Why is it so stressful?
Yeah, because during the holidays, we're socializing more, we're doing more, we're spending more, we're eating more, and we're obviously sleeping less because of all those things.
And there are extra expectations on us, these big expectations. Things have to look a certain way, feel a certain way. Like Christmas Vacation is one of our favorite movies. We were talking pre-podcast, and that's a good illustration of kind of putting upon yourself a lot of expectations. There's financial stress. We've talked about like finances are one of the biggest stressors consistently if you're surveying people. And, at this time of year, it really, especially during the middle of a global pandemic, that's been financially stressful. Like that's bigger this year, bigger stressor. If you have social anxiety, I know I really, really don't like crowded shopping centers. So in a typical year, like this time of year just really stresses me out, and I can barely stand to go to a mall or a Best Buy and walk through because just the amount of people crunched into one space. Overcommitment is a big thing. So for us introverts, for example, going to a lot of events, buying a lot of gifts for a lot of different people. And there's, like office gifts, relative gifts that you don't see very often, like cousins and distant aunts, planning those. A lot of phone calls and video calls this year. So you're going to probably, or you have already, going to get these requests for, oh, let's connect, let's do a Zoom, this day, and all of those commitments. And it's not just stress. We're going to focus on stress because it's something we generally focus on, but sadness and loneliness and discouragement or despair, those kind of blue emotions, those are a big part of the holidays too for a lot of people. Even in a normal year, the holidays can bring grief for one, because we don't have all the people around us necessarily, and we miss some people who aren't in our lives.
Right, but we are not in a normal year, so that is just making all things that much worse. So Nick started to say a little bit about like the financial stress due to this global pandemic, but there's so many other like amplified stressors now because of what we're going through. I think financial stress is clearly a big one, but like missing out on the people that we want to see. I know Jack and I usually have to split our time between my family and his family. Well, this year we don't get to see anybody's family. So it's tough, I think, like originally without all of the extra stuff, but the pandemic has definitely made things so much worse.
And part of the reason on the podcast why we go into, what's the problem, is to kind of set up the why, to justify, like, why are we talking about self-care, why you should care, why people in your life should care about self-care. And we feel a need to do that because it's just important to send this message, like, self-care isn't selfish. We need to hear that a lot. It isn't indulgent. It's not a Band-Aid. It isn't fluffy. It doesn't have to be a spa day. That might jump into what people's heads when they hear the phrase self-care. It could be a spa day. Spa days are lovely, but it doesn't have to be. I was at a conference, the one we referenced in our opening earlier this week, talking to a teacher from New Jersey and a teacher from California. And the teacher from California was sharing a self-care presentation that she did at her school. And the teacher from New Jersey was just, in her feedback, was saying, well, people in California and Minnesota might be really receptive to this, but people in Jersey and New York are a little bit more like, oh, it's a little fluffy. And first of all, my reaction was, well, like, in Minnesota, we're open-minded folks, but, don't just go wrapping us in with those folks in California. We're a bit different culturally than them.
Don't you know?
Don't you know? We're in the middle of the country, not the West Coast then. But really, though, we need that reminder, like, self-care it isn't selfish. It isn't this extra thing to just indulge ourselves with. Like we've talked about in the pandemic, it's biological. Cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, those are real hormones and chemicals flowing through your body. And for most of us, like, this is an ongoing traumatic event, too much for too long, of cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine. That's real. That affects us biologically. It affects the choices we make. It affects our health. And that rate has been too high for too long, for almost 9 months now. I always lose track. And now we're hitting the holidays, which, like we said, is normally a stressful event. So we probably shouldn't have to justify self-care, but it is really important. Like, taking time to take care of ourselves is really important and worthwhile. And, if you need an analogy for that, car maintenance is one, like we need to take care of the engine on our car. And that's kind of like what self-care is a little bit. Like, we need to take care of ourselves, our body and our brain and our hearts, just like we would do preventative maintenance on a car.
Absolutely. My doctor actually used that analogy with me at my checkup this past fall. She said, how's your mental health? How are you taking care of yourself? I mean, if you don't check in on yourself, it's like your engine's breaking down. So I thought that was kind of neat. But all of that being said, let's talk about important self-care strategies for the holidays.
And one of the first we wanted to talk about is stress-proofing your relationship, like with your partner. And we're going to run through kind of a way to do this. Kind of one of the big stressors that tends to come into your relationships at this time of year is all the stuff that you have to do as a couple, especially if we have kids. There's just this list of tasks. We got to put up the lights. We got to put up the Christmas tree. We got to shop for presents. All those tasks can create a lot of stress on a relationship, and your relationship can either be a buoy for you emotionally to help your resilience, or it can, if there's tension there, it can be another stressor, worrying about the status of my relationship. The Gottman Institute, plug for them. They're a really good Instagram follow. I imagine Facebook and Twitter as well, but just I happen to see them on Instagram. Gottman is a amazing decades of research on relationships and how they work. He did a lot of amazing research into predicting divorce. Just short little plug for them, by the way. But one piece of advice they shared heading into the holiday season is creating a holiday plan with your partner. So step one of that would be to list out all those chores and responsibilities that require your attention together as a household or as a unit, as a partnership. And that'll give you a view of all those things that you can go from. And again, that could be like shopping for presents, for cards, wrapping presents, making dinner on Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, shopping for food. We're a little late to the party with some of those things I listed. I imagine some people have done some of that shopping for presents or putting up the tree by this point when the podcast comes out. But I'm guessing there's still a fair number of tasks that you could list out that have to be done by the 25th.
Absolutely. So the next step would then be to add to that list 3 columns. One of the columns would be for you, one for your partner, and then the last one would be the pieces that both of you share, the responsibilities that you share. So then read over the list together, talk about each other's perception of how the holidays responsibilities were handled in the past. I know sometimes in different years things go better, things go smoother, sometimes things are not so great. So I think it's important to discuss how you would like them to be handled this year and be pretty clear with your partner about things that bothered you or things that you want to be different. Go through the items that are easy to assign, choose who is responsible, and then make sure you put a check mark on that list so that you and your partner both know who is responsible, and then set through things that need to be talked about later.
Yeah, and first pass is like that low-hanging fruit. So like it's pretty easy to just decide like who's gonna put up the Christmas tree. Maybe that's easy. Maybe that's a really tough one. No judgments here. And then number 5 on this would be like that second pass for the tougher items that weren't really easy to assign to one of you or both of you on the first pass. And then Gottman just encourages you to have some open-ended questions about those tasks, and then truly listening to your partner. So maybe don't start with like a why question of the open-ended questions, like things that start with why, like why don't you like putting up the Christmas tree, or why don't you like shopping? They tend to just they're more aggressive. So like maybe like what part of shopping don't you like, and just listening to them and not trying to jump in and offer a solution or contradict them. Just let them speak and just hear them out, and then having a thoughtful conversation with your partner about those tougher items. And again, this whole process is basically just trying to plan ahead for these things that are going to be stressful and have a dialogue about them so that you have some plan and it's less likely to just blow up in both of your faces with all of the stress and arguments that can come from that. And I think this is just a good reminder, and we wanted to pause here to say the 3 of us aren't perfect. I feel like that's just a good thing to remind ourselves of, especially when we're doing a self-care series and a podcast. This is a nice experience of doing this podcast and this series about self-care just for our own self-care of the things that we should be doing. And, you don't have to be perfect to be an educator or a parent or a podcaster. The 3 of us are doing our best. You guys who are listening are doing your best. I personally, when I was reading through that list and that process from Gottman, need a reminder about this and to have a thoughtful dialogue about division of labor with my romantic partner. And if Christina were here, she could certainly vouch for that we need to revisit the division of labor around some of these things.
Oh, yeah, totally. So I do really appreciate these simple solutions because I can't even tell you how many years and how many times Nate has sat around the living room circle, as the girls are opening presents, or even his parents are opening presents, and he doesn't even know what we got them or what he got them until they've actually opened it in front of him. So because I did all of the holiday shopping and all of the wrapping and took on all that stress. But if I were just, he'd be more than willing to come to the store. I mean, maybe, throw a little bit of a tantrum about having to go into a busy store like you, Nick, but he would be more than willing to do it if I just said, hey, I really need you or want you to be a part of this. But when you put it all on yourself, it really isn't even fun anymore by the time Christmas comes.
Mm-hmm. So another strategy that we want to talk about is just tuning in with ourselves and being mindful about what we're feeling. I think a lot of times people hold the stress in and put on that front about like, I know this is great, this is fun, but really inside we are not necessarily feeling the fun and the great vibes. And if we hold all that stress in, it oftentimes results in us later on unexpectedly at a very inopportune moment flipping our lid.
Yeah, and again, this reminds me of Christmas Vacation. And at one point before this episode, I was flirting with the idea of just walking through Christmas Vacation and deconstructing Clark Griswold's descent into madness during that movie. Because if you've seen the movie, and I think a lot of people have by this point, is all these horrible, stressful things keep happening. And he just keeps playing off this narrative like, I'm fine. And his family starts to question like, dude, you're not fine. Like, you're clearly stressed out. You're raising your voice. You're shouting out the neighbors. Just try and handle it better. And he's just not acknowledging it and probably just kind of suppressing all of that until, at the end, there's a lot of rage and chainsaws and all that insanity. It's a comedy movie. It's not a horror movie if you just happen to have not seen Christmas Vacation.
Absolutely. So it's just super important that we tune into our senses and we're mindful about what we're going through and just noticing when we feel off, what's going on around us when we're feeling off, try to pick up on those patterns. Stress can be like a boiling frog in a pot. I love that analogy for most things. When you get comfortable, it's just like you tune out and you don't notice that things are getting more intense. You're quickening heart rate, muscle tension until it's too late and we're at the flip the lid point, or the boiling frog. Like all of a sudden it's way too hot. So then we can take it out on people and make bigger problems for ourselves as a result.
Yeah, and it's not, that's a self-awareness piece, like just staying in tune and just taking a moment, honestly, just to pay attention to your body and just say like, what is going on with me? Am I really okay? Or do I need to try and use one of my other strategies to chill out? And that could be just taking a couple deep breaths, like walk to the kitchen and take a couple of deep breaths. If we recognize, hey, I'm talking to my uncle in the living room and it's getting really frustrating for me and I just need to take a minute to cool myself off, for example. Another thing that we can do is like expressing yourself. So naming our feelings is one example of that. We talked about this, like just calling out, name it to tame it. Calling out one of those feelings makes it a little bit less scary because you've got that quickening heart rate, that muscle tension. You're off, you're like keyed up. So recognizing that is a good step, and then just giving it a name. So like, I'm frustrated, I'm anxious, I'm disappointed. Like those, just naming it makes it a little bit less scary. And if you haven't already from listening to this podcast, we're big fans of the Mood Meter app. So if you haven't downloaded that by this point, and if you're a repeat listener or just hearing this episode and haven't heard of that before, it's $1. There's no subscription. You just buy it for the $1 the one time. And it's so very, very simple to use. A lot of those mental health apps, self-care apps are pretty complicated. They ask you to listen to things. Mood Meter is just, open it up. It helps you pick a word for what you're feeling in a very easy way. And that's basically it. It gives you a little tip if you want to shift what you're feeling, but really nice way to our phones are always on us. Actually build a habit around naming our feelings. And then just finding someone, and this could be someone you're texting, like a friend. It could be your partner. It could be a family member who you get along with and you're really close with. But someone, doesn't matter who it is, and who you can tell what you're feeling, and they're going to listen and empathize and try and understand you. And that's what we mean by empathize, like try and be on the same page with you instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. And they're not going to offer these unsolicited advice and solutions, because really, like Clark Griswold, like if he had gone and talked, I can't remember what the actress's name is, just had a chat and just let it out and let that pressure release off, probably would have solved some of the problems in those movies versus trying to hold it all in until the end when he just explodes at everyone.
Absolutely. The next strategy is talking back to negative self-talk. So in one of the other podcasts, we talked a little bit about the stories that we tell ourselves. And for this one, it's more about those negative stories that we're telling ourselves. So our inner monologue is just not always helpful. It's not always accurate or right or even real or based in reality. So we just need to make sure that we are challenging those things that we're telling ourselves and making sure that we are grounding ourselves and not giving those things too much attention. So some examples of that, like those should statements. So these presents should be wrapped perfectly. To who needs them wrapped perfectly? Make sure we challenge those things. Or I shouldn't be having the kids watch so much screen time. Based on what? We're stressed. We need to do what we need to do to manage. So just a reminder to be gentle with yourself and not beat yourself up.
And that kind of flows into, I mean, one of the things those stories that we're telling ourselves can lead us into is overcommitment. Like, you know, I should be doing all these things. I should be buying presents for my coworkers or participating in this. Boundaries and just learning to say no, or just saying no, is another thing that's really important this time of year. And we might overcommit at this time of the year because of fear of missing out, FOMO. As you're planning, and again, having dialogue with the people in your life about how the holidays are going to go, and this could be your family, your kids, this could be your coworkers, whenever you're having conversations about how the holidays are going to go, trying to keep a routine and not fill up the days too much. So if you recognize that like the last couple holidays have been really stressful because we committed to too much, putting that out there and just saying like, I'd like to be intentional this year about saying no to some things so that we have some days where it's just us staying in and watching a movie together or baking cookies, just some alone time. And of course, this year, it's probably going to be easier to have that happen, you know, staying at home doing stuff. But I mean, just the analog is like Zoom time, like some nights where we're not on Zooms with people and we're just staying together and having time as a family, for example. Just one example that I came to mind when I was thinking about setting boundaries at this time of the year was at a school I worked at, we were talking about holiday events and planning them as a staff. And we talked about like potlucks or gift exchanges. And I really appreciated that a couple teachers just voiced like, you know what, like I really like that pageantry. It is really nice, but there's so much of stuff going on right now that's on my plate. And it would probably be better for me overall if I just opted out of those things. No offense to you guys, like you guys can keep going with it, but you know, I love you guys. I just would rather not do a potluck or a gift exchange because it's just one other thing that's going to be on my list, and I'll just find other ways to like show that I appreciate you and take part in the joy of the season. And I think that's just really a great example, and I keep remembering it obviously and coming back to it because, you know, coming back to that idea of what we control versus what we influence versus what we can't. Like, you can't control how your coworkers feel. You can control your choices and taking care of yourself. Like, it really might mean like saying no to some things. You can influence how other people feel. You can't control it, but you can influence it by just kind of honestly articulating your needs like those teachers did. And I wasn't offended. They couldn't have controlled one way or another if I got offended or not. They can just put it out there respectfully. And then if they notice that I take incredible offense to this idea that they didn't want to take part in the gift exchange, then they can just let that go. Like, they don't have to take my stress on.
Another thing that we can do to have some control over our situations is to limit that time we spend online. More specifically, limiting that time that we are engaged in social media. It can often look like everyone has this great life and everything's really put together and orderly and nice and happy and wonderful and beige. I see a lot of beige and white, and that's just not the reality. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that our life is the way it is, and looking online at what other people are doing isn't super helpful. So I know with work, a lot of us have to be online so much that it's just probably we're just focused on our computers or on our phones or whatever, but acknowledging when you've spent a little bit too much time in those devices or on that social media is super important. I myself, since we got into TikTok, have noticed a drastic increase in my screen time. So I've made a goal for myself to really try to get that down, because it's just not helpful. It's not helpful or healthy. It's taking away from me doing other things that would be much more beneficial to my life, like wrapping presents or going for a walk or whatever. So just limiting that time that we spend online is another thing we can control.
And talking about like screen time even, like I've just noticed with the increase this week and my screen time, like it's affected my sleep too. So like we talked about getting less sleep from the holidays in general, like the time online when you are scrolling through the beautiful houses and the beautiful decorations, like it can affect your sleep in other ways too.
Mm-hmm. The last thing we were going to talk about as a tip is looking for the bright spots. And this is one we haven't talked about on the podcast before. This comes from this book, Onward. You may have mentioned us referencing. It's written by former teacher and instructional coach, Elena Aguilar. It's about emotional resilience, specifically for educators. And she recommends that this is something teachers revisit in December at this time of the year, looking for the bright spots. Because in a typical year, I don't know if anybody listening has ever seen that chart of the school year and kind of well-being for educators, but it kind of starts very positive. There's a dip in the middle of the year. We tend to hit that point in around November, December, where we're really on the struggle bus. And then we kind of gradually rebound through the spring. And I was just thinking about that last night and thinking, like, this school year is just, that chart is way off. Like, it's probably a little bit of a dip right now. But like, we're probably flying all over the place with our well-being this year because of just what a weird year it is. But anyway, one thing Aguilar reflected on this was, as a teacher, she had this activity and we thought it was kind of cool, so we thought it would be cool to share. She did this with her students, but she says that as an instructional coach now, she's also done it in a ton of meetings and trainings. What she did is called the Secret Admirer activity. And what she did is she would assign a student to a peer for the entire day. So she'd meet with like Johnny at the beginning of the day and say, all right, you're going to watch Sarah through the whole day. And anything that she does that's awesome and positive, you remember. And then at the end of the day, you're going to report out with the class. And nobody knew who the secret admirer was during the day. So, and then at the end of the day, they would find out that, you know, Johnny was watching Sarah, and Johnny would share all these wonderful things that Sarah did with the class. And her students loved it. And she would do this every day. Like I said, she'd have challenge days where she'd assign multiple names. So one person would be in charge of watching like 2 students as the, you know, secret admirer. She would have Me Too days where students would also report back about themselves. And she surveyed her students mid-year, and they said universally across the board, this is something that they wanted to keep doing for the rest of the year. So that could be something as a school staff that you, again, she says she's done it in trainings, in team meetings. I think that'd be a really fun thing for some of the teams that I'm in. Maybe we should do that the next time the 3 of us meet, is have a secret admirer. It just helps you look for the bright spots, which is really hard to do. And one of the reasons that's really hard to do is we have a negativity bias. That's a jargony word, but a negativity bias, all human beings do. And there's ideas about why this happens. But if you think about human history, our brains are trained to look for threats, things that could go wrong. So when human beings were being hunted by lions and tigers and bears, we had to not pay so much attention to all of the beautiful sunshine and the grasslands around us, be really looking out for the weird movements that suggest that there's a scary tiger hunting us, trying to eat us. So that's one idea of like why we developed this as human beings. But we're just always on the lookout for these things that are going wrong and aren't just habitually trained to acknowledge all the wonderful bright spots around us, the things that are going well, the things that we're grateful for. And another thing that Elena writes about in her book is people tend to get praised and be seen as more competent if they are cynical. So if they're criticizing things, pointing out flaws or reasons why something's not going to work, we tend to see those people who are criticizing things and pointing out like, oh, I have a question about this and it's probably not going to work for this reason. We tend to think, well, that person's really smart. They're really on the ball. Like they really know what they're doing, versus like the optimist, cheerful, like, oh, you know, we could do this. Like we just tend culturally to see them as more naive and not as bright. And that's just unfortunate. I think that's just one of those things culturally across the board. And then in education, and when I was reading her writing about it, I was thinking, really relating to it. Like, it's just hard to be the person who's trying to point out all the things that are going right, pointing out all the bright spots. And she also shared an anecdote of a teacher she was a coach for, and the teacher didn't want to be observed by Elena as an instructional coach because she said, my classroom sucks. Like, don't come on. I don't want you to come because you're just going to observe a teacher who sucks, and that's not going to be any fun for you. And they gradually negotiated. Elena got to observe for 10 minutes, and she wrote down 28 positive things the first day. And she was thinking, like, is this just like an aberrant, weird day where everything's going right? And then she met with the teacher afterward, and the teacher was like, all right, come on, like, you struggled to write anything down, didn't you? And shared her perspective of the day and was pointing out all these things that she thought had gone terribly. And then Elena was like, well, yeah, but, like, sure. But like she pointed out all these wonderful things that had happened. And she just noticed that by keeping this routine, she repeatedly observed this teacher. The teacher developed a habit where she started to look for these bright spots, and they'd see each other in the hallway, and the teacher would start to tell Elena, like, oh, this happened today, and this happened today, and acknowledging more of those bright spots. And that can inspire us and just build our resilience, because it's just easier to get through the day and can help us be more effective in general if we're looking out for what's going well versus just focusing entirely on the things that are going wrong. So there are a couple ways to do this. I mean, you could, with gratitude, with looking for the bright spots, like, we're talking about building habits. So it's also individual. Like, you could write down a list of 3 things at the end of your work day. Like, that could be your transition to the end of the work day, actually. That's one of the great self-care tips for the pandemic, is when we're working from home, having some kind of ritual to transition. Like, I'm done with my work day, I'm now transitioning to personal time. Writing down 3 things, 3 bright spots, 3 things you're grateful for. It could be a nice ritual if you wanted to build the habit in that way. The other thing is just trying to set an intention. So, like, before a class, for example, you could say, like, my intention, I'm going to look for at least 3 things, 3 bright spots that are going right. So a student who spoke up who typically doesn't, or a student who said something nice about a peer, or a student who offered to help me when I needed a volunteer. Just setting that intention before an amount of time, like a class or a meeting, to look and remind yourself to look. You could put a little rubber band around your finger if that helps. But those are just some ideas of how to start to build in that habit, because it really needs to be a habit of looking for those bright spots. All right, let's talk takeaways, guys. We're going to wrap up the episode. So, like we said at the beginning, the holidays, they bring stress. They can bring sadness and loneliness. And it really does take some reflection, some dialogue with the people in our lives, our coworkers, our family, and some intentionality to find enjoyment in the season. And that's what we want for you guys. And the 3 of us are seeking this holiday in a really difficult year, is a lot of enjoyment and gratitude in the season. And some questions you could ask overall are just like, what normally works for me? Like, what's my normal self-care practices that keep me going and keep me resilient, and trying to preserve and plan to preserve as much of that as possible. So that could be like making time, crafting time, and setting boundaries so you have the time to do the things that normally keep you going, like listening to your favorite podcast. And then anticipating, like, it's gonna be different. It's gonna change up our routines. Like, this is a atypical time of year, the holidays. We're going to be doing extra stuff, doing more, socializing more, anticipating those stressors, and just planning out how I'm going to deal with this. And then again, the dialogue with the people in your life, like, how are we going to deal with this together?
Well, we hope you found some of these ideas and strategies helpful as you go into the holiday season. We just wanted to thank you for spending some time with us today. Make sure to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. We'll see you when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.